Buongiorno, good morning to everybody, and welcome here in this wonderful church. It is with really great pleasure that today we host here Dr. Ido Harris, the man who, with the invention of the matrix, changed modern archaeology. So first of all, thank you, Ido, for being here. We are really proud of it, especially because this is the only event organized in Europe in your presence to celebrate the anniversary. Although I believe that no one needs to have a presentation of Ido Harris, I'll give you a very short biography of him. Ido Harris is a Bermudian archaeologist. He did a degree at Columbia University, New York, where he received the BA in anthropology in 1971. He took his PhD at University College of London in 1979, and he returned to Bermuda in 1980, where he became the first director of the National Museum of Bermuda. In 1973, he created the so-called Harris matrix, the first application of which was made on the field in 1974, on the excavation of the remains of the south gate to the Roman city of Winchester. Following the invention of the matrix in 1973, he was able to make the notion of stratigraphy and its application in archaeology the subject of a doctoral thesis at University College of London. The thesis was published in 1979 by Academic Press with the title that we know, Principle of Archaeological Stratigraphy. Since that date, Principle of Archaeological Stratigraphy has been translated in Italian, Spanish, French, Polish, Japanese, Slovene, German, Hungarian, Czech, and Arabic. A Chinese translation is in progress. At the beginning of 2022, looking for a topic for our YouTube channel, CAMNES Studio, we tracked down Edward in Bermuda and invited him to give an interview for us, which he did on May of that year. After that interview, we reflected that 2023 would mark the 50th anniversary of the invention of the matrix. So we asked Edward if he had something in mind to celebrate it. And he told us that he would love to be in Europe. So we therefore invited him to come in Florence, and here we are. This seminar aims to be a simple contribution to the celebration of this anniversary. For obvious reasons, this will not be the place to delve into theoretical or methodological questions. We hope that this event can be a pleasant moment of reflection on what the matrix has represented and represents in contemporary archaeology. Because sometimes the most obvious things are the most important ones, which we cannot do without. And I say this especially for the students that are here, and I thank the students to come. Before to start, let me thank the other guests of this seminar, Daniele Manacorda, Paolo Liverani, Federico Cantini, Elisabetta Giorgi, and Michele Nucciotti, and Wolfgang Neubauer, that comes from Austria. So, thank all of you, and I leave now the floor to Paolo Liverani, that will be the chair of this seminar, and we can continue with our work now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefano. Yes, we can begin with our it's not a round table, but a table. And I will give the stage to the various colleagues today, and I hope they can maintain the time 10, 15 as maximum, so that I have a a clock here, and I will advise the colleague, or myself, of course, when we arrive to 10 minutes, so that they have to resume the last part of the speech. Please, Daniele Manacorda can begin our tour. Please, Daniele, you can begin.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Edward Harris. Many thanks to him for being here today, and to those who organized this meeting, which allows us to spend a few hours in the company of a piece of contemporary archaeological history. Among us archaeologists, the Harris Matrix. Ce la facciamo andare avanti? Che devo fare? Puzzi il tasto sopra. Eccolo. Ma non è questa. Ci arriviamo, eh? Possiamo anche farne a meno. Vabbè, si è disallineato. I was saying, among us archaeologists, the Harris Matrix is something as famous as the Rubik's Cube. There is no one who does not know it. It is another thing to know how to use it in the best possible way. I was 30 years old when his book came out, which finally clarified two concepts, stratification and stratigraphy, which were confusedly used together, almost if they were two synonyms. That distinction formed the basis of the theory developed by Edward, also very young, very young, in the early 70s in Winchester, Great Britain. Driven by the practical need to master the enormous mass of data produced by an urban excavation, he then invented a system of graphic representation on a two-dimensional plane of the three-dimensional reality of archaeological certification in its spatio-temporal dimensions, the so-called Harris matrix. We, in Italy, immediately adopted that ingenious operational tool, which quickly became the symbol of a new season, based on the conceptual elaboration of the principles of archaeological certification and its disassembly, which preside over its interpretation. Harris's argumentation, in fact, presents from the cultural and historical aspects of archaeological contexts. Rather, it identifies the general principles involved in the organization of certification. It is thus universally applicable to any archaeological site. I will go further, even outside the archaeological dimension, I would say in every corner of our daily lives. Archaeological certification is composed of individual stratigraphic units, positive or negative traces of the actions of man and nature. The set of stratigraphic units analyzed in their reciprocal relationships constitutes the stratigraphic sequence. It is thus the result of the analysis of the certification based on the observation of certain laws, original continuity, original horizontality, superposition, stratigraphic sections and synthetically represented in the stratigraphic diagram. Harris' theorization was translated into a vademecum of procedures that today constitute a widespread and accepted common heritage, to which the computer revolution was later applied. His thought has also met with great success in Italy, and I had the privilege of editing the Italian edition of this book, which every student has had and still has in his hands. Today, the matrix accompanies any archaeological research, both in buried stratifications and in those, often very complex, present in architecture. Certainly, discussions have not been lacking. For example, about the relationship between the construction of the stratigraphic sequence of a site, which is unique and unrepeatable, and the cultural historical questions that guide our research. Or about the possibility of describing within the matrix the duration of individual stratigraphic units. It has the visualization of time in stratification. Or about the importance of recognizing the elements of uncertainty sometimes present in the construction of the sequence, generated by the objective and subjective conditions in which one operates. In circles closer to processual archaeology, observations have concerned the risk of an oversimplification of stratigraphic articulation and an alleged separation of archaeology from geology. It is clear, however, that archaeological deposits, while falling under the general laws of sedimentation, are the result of cultural phenomena of the interaction between nature and culture, and thus represent a very particular aspect of stratification, one that is much more complicated. This does not imply any less importance of questions concerning the nature of stratification, which is the primary source of archaeological investigation on the ground. It is essential for understanding the significance of the context we investigate, the function of the layers, the manner of their formation, what we call formative processes. The importance of the surfaces, hence of the interfaces on which the construction of the matrix is based, is not in contrast with the attention to the volumes, which give body to the stratification, to the material of which they are composed. In fact, everything contributes to the reconstruction of history, which is the main purpose for which we construct the stratigraphic sequence of a site. The matrix represents an abstract, ordered, and as someone said, harmonic image of a reality, the ground we excavate, that is instead by its very nature concrete, disordered, and anything but harmonic. This is why the matrix is within it has within it a powerful aesthetic charge. It is the beauty of the context and its representation. It is an aesthetic image that helps us perceive what Andrea Candini has called the ethics of context. It is a beauty that a great historian of the 20th century, always capable of looking beyond his own discipline, invited us to find in an appropriate sentence as well as in an exact equation. Think of the ingenious sobriety of Einstein's relativity formula. Because, said Marc Bloch, every science has its own aesthetics of language. Behind the beauty of a formula or a scheme may lie the representation of an entire universe. This is why the harmony of a matrix, which lucidly gives an account of the complexity of a disassembled and reassembled stratification, repays the effort of the archaeologist. Of course, we will never cease to recommend to young people approaching the archaeologist's profession to be clear that the stratigraphic diagram does not serve to distinguish the layers in the course of our analytical work. The matrix serves to order the graphic and conceptual representation of this section, and if anything, to consciously plan the actions to be performed on the ground. And above all, we know that it is not enough to produce a matrix to certify that the layers in it have been effectively distinguished and disassembled in the course of the excavation. Things are not done better, as used to be said, because they are done by computer. Behind matrix, there is attention, intelligence, passion. 50 years after the first diagram created by Edward, I would say that the matrix is a bit like a toothbrush. Once invented, it can always be improved and modernized, but there is no going back. Our lives as archaeologists would have been different if a young British archaeologist had not one day decided to simplify life for himself by inventing a tool which in a short time simplified it for all of us and lead the way. After half a century, we still say thank you, Edward.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniele, for this very clear introduction and also for observing the time, not least. And now is my turn, and I start. Yes. Could you start? Yes, thank you. The stick is very important. No. Come si fa ad andare indietro? Indietro. Eccolo, grazie. Okay. This meeting commemorates the 50th anniversary of Edward Harris Matrix, a model that formalized and standardized the recording of stratigraphic data from an archaeological excavation and is now used systematically in many countries. In my talk, I would like to build on this milestone and explore what is being done to extend the stratigraphic method beyond the excavation of a site. Today, I want to look at the need to deal with the large urban areas, or at least large part of them. In this case, there is a leap in scale with the consequent difficulty of dealing with an impressive amount of data. Moreover, it is rarely possible to carry out a complete or almost complete excavation, especially in cities with continuity of life. In this case, it is necessary to integrate different approaches in which stratigraphic excavation is one of the tools of investigation, although it remains the only one that can provide detailed and certain evidence. In order to study the urban evolution of a settlement, it is necessary to use architectural surveys, archival data, which especially in the case of old excavations don't necessarily have the rigorous formalization of the matrix, historical cartography, non-invasive diagnostic surveys, which have a much higher degree of approximation than a stratigraphic excavation and, especially in a modern city, are subject to interference and disturbance from more recent phases of life. Finally, core drilling both for public and private works of various kinds and for archaeological research is a considerable help. They can also provide relevant data for paleoenvironmental studies. Urban life may have changed the geomorphology of the land considerably, but this problem has not always been addressed systematically. In the case of Rome, Giuseppe Lugli had already made some interesting general observation in 1951. Daniele Manacorda has returned to the subject in a recent book and has rightly insisted on the importance of considering the layers of landfill of the city as a whole in its life of more than 2 millennia. Over the past few years, we have addressed these issues in the context of Rome Transformed, a project funded by the European Research Council, which is now in its fourth year and brings together the universities of Newcastle and Florence, the British School at Rome, and the Italian National Council of Research. The PI of our group is Professor Ian Haynes of Newcastle. We soon realized that a broad approach was needed, going beyond the documentation and visualization of a single excavation, building, or monument. Rather, it is a question of studying an area which, as such, poses specific problems that have not been sufficiently focused on until now. It is a step that, as I have already mentioned, involves a leap in terms of size and data management. In fact, at this level, the detailed visualization of the individual excavation area or building, while still important, takes second place to the overall topographical understanding, the reconstruction of its historical evolution and urban dynamics. For this purpose, it is necessary to start from the palimpsest formed by the geomorphology of the area under study and its modifications, sometimes considerable, over the centuries. This palimpsest defines the conditions of existence of the topographical and monumental articulation of the city, forms the substratum that directs and conditions all urban and monumental reconstructions, constitutes the frame of reference and the broader meaning of these transformations. It is therefore necessary to go beyond a purely planar and two-dimensional topography based solely on the analysis of plans and to integrate the third dimension and thus the stratification of successive monumental and urban interventions. In order to understand the significant relationship between the various urban elements, it is not enough to reconstruct the topography as a given historical moment, but it is necessary to follow its diachronic evolution in order to identify the constraints that the earliest phases imposed on the later ones. A simple example in the Lateran area is the succession between the Severan phase of the Castranova of the Equites Singulares with its adjacent baths and the Constantinian phase of the Lateran Basilica with its baptistry. The location of the baptistry would remain incomprehensible as it is situated behind the basilica and 6 meters lower, if it not for the fact, on the one hand, that the baptistry made use of the baths, probably linked to the Castranova, and of its water channel. On the other hand, that during the Easter liturgy, the celebrant with the catechumens leaving the basilica and heading towards the baptistry walked along what in Severan times was the external continuation of the Via Principalis of the Castranova. There are many cases where the reconstruction of the orography and its evolution can radically change our ideas. In our area, for example, we know that the Caelian Hill underwent profound changes in ancient times. The construction of the Aurelian Wall, for example, resulted in the damming of a valley, which caused problems for the drainage of the water and had important consequences for the stability of the walls themselves. Downstream of the walls, around the water course that flows under the Lateran, known as the Marrana, there was considerable silting up, as can be seen from the difference in level between the Porta Asinaria of Aurelian and that of Honorius. Other serious interventions were carried out in modern times with the leveling of Monte Cipollaro, southwest of Santa Croce in Jerusalem, and the modification of the slopes of Piazza San Giovanni, which was still marked at the beginning of the 18th century by an abrupt jump in height formed by the substructures of the triclinium of Pope Leo III, as can be seen in the views of the time. Finally, in modern times, large quantities of topsoil were dumped behind the Aurelian wall, only part of which has been removed in recent years for conservation reasons. In order to accurately reconstruct this complex history, it is necessary to develop a methodology that is not based on approximate intuitions, but then that defines a uniform procedure for the entire area of investigation. It is therefore necessary to have an environment in which it is possible to incorporate evidence of a very heterogeneous nature, as I mentioned at the beginning. This environment must be structured in such a way that it can return data respecting the FAIR principle and that it can constitute a working tool capable of progressively integrating new acquisitions in a dynamic manner. To meet these needs, my colleague Margherita Azzari, together with Vincenzo Bologna and the LabGeo laboratory team in our department, developed a software solution and created a tool capable of handling stratigraphic data. The first generation of this tool is called RT3D, Room Transformed 3D. RT3D allows the collection and comparison of the data obtained using different surveying methods and the retrieval of strictly geometric information to be translated into GIS elements to generate digital terrain models. Data entry is done using batch tools and form filling, import scripts, load records based on an Excel or CSV structure with corresponding fields defined by each team. After software processing and validation, the data can be exported as ArcGIS shape files. Each layer produced by a GPR survey can be represented by a raster in which the anomalies are displayed using a color scale based on the megahertz response of the anomalies detected by the instrument. Each layer can be exported in DAT format, representing each point with 3D coordinates and the corresponding megahertz bandwidth. RT3D will only import points with the selected bandwidth, which is useful for defining meaningful dimension for DTM generation. Once imported, the data is translated into a GIS geometry called multipoint Z, which relates multiple point Zs to each other. This ensures that the roof and the bed elevation information of each stratigraphy is maintained. In the 3D viewer, the data is displayed as points connected by segments, allowing the acquired core to be visually identified in three-dimensional space. The interpretation can be repeated for each individual core point. Once the interpretation of the data is complete, it is possible to export all the data the points, in the RT3D database in Esri shapefile format, which is compatible with all GIS processing programs. The files can be imported directly into ArcGIS and contain not only the planned geometries, but also the table with all the stratigraphic information. Over the next few weeks, we will try to standardize and automate the process as much as possible. The result will be a kind of spatial matrix that shows the basic phases but contains all the essential data and can be refined, modified, and updated based on further research and discoveries. The various DTMs produced will be able to provide the basis for visualizing the topography of each of the macrophases identified to support the historical topographical reconstruction, integrating 3D models of the surveyed buildings, infrastructure, and environmental situation into the visualization, but will be also invaluable for communicating the results to the scientific community and the wider public. Thank you for your attention. Yes, now is the turn of Cantini. Please.
Ora sì, ecco. Thank you, especially to CAMNES, to invite me to this event. The introduction in 1973 and the dissemination of Harris metrics were a revolution, especially in archaeological practice and in archaeological thinking. The protagonists of the research were no longer only the hard objects and monuments, but the stratigraphy sequence with its physical relationships and temporal succession. In this way, I think, archaeology definitely moved away from antiquarian research and became history. Adopting Harris metrics represented a Darwinian advantageous mutation that allowed to investigate complex sites, having a perfect tool not only for management of large masses of data, but also for their interpretation. Even today, I still think that the method introduced by Harris is the best possible method to document what has been excavated and destroyed forever. This is also shown by the fact that it has been widely applied, even with some clarification. We can remind the work of Gianni Chedda and Maura Medri, published in Archaeology of Architecture, to the reading of stratigraphies of standing structure, as a 2003 article of Harris, published always in Archaeology of Architecture, states. The value of the method is not undermined, in my opinion, even by the observation that stratigraphic units are not objective realities in absolute terms. The excavator's stratigraphy, sensitivity, his goals, and the economic resources have a weight on their definition. Today, I think, it would be impossible to direct a large excavation by not providing for the elaboration of Harris metrics. At last, that is the case for the campaigns that the University of Pisa conducts in Tuscany, Italy, and around the world. At San Genesio, we have documented thousands of stratigraphic units from the Hellenistic age to the 15th century. It would have been impossible to manage this data without the use of the matrix. The matrix is indispensable to the excavation, and it is built and it's taught to the students on the excavation during the definition of the relative relationship between the different stratigraphic units. But its elaboration does not end on the site. Only with a philological study of the finds, coupled with absolute dates obtained by the most different archaeometric method, can the sequence be linked to an absolute chronology, useful in the definition of phases and periods. We must remember, however, that the matrix is and remain a tool and not the goal of the archaeological investigation, which remains historical reconstruction. But to have a good historical reconstruction is necessary a good strategy, a good stratigraphic excavation, a good matrix, a good findings study, and a good interpretation in the wider historical frame. I will end my brief talk with a reminder. I was born with Harris matrix, both from an ethnographic point of view, because I was born in 1973, and from an academic point of view. In fact, in the elaboration of my dissertation, which involved the study and the edition of the Montorrenti cave stole excavation, directed by Riccardo Frankovic and Richard Hodges, I immediately had to deal with a matrix that had hundreds of stratigraphic units, which the British team had printed in many paper strips with a dot matrix printer. I think it was one of the first matrix processed with a computer. I remember the struggle to reassemble the various strips into one large sheet that I kept taped on the wall of my room. If the archaeologists of the time had not processed the matrix, today the Montorrenti site, which has been so important for medieval archaeology in Italy, would still unpublished. So even for this reason, today we must say thank you to Edward Harris. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Stefano Valentini and Guido Guarducci for organizing this event. And it is a great honor for me to be here today to celebrate the 5th anniversary of Harris Matrix, alongside Daniele Manacorda, who is the person who introduced me to the matrix many years ago, and also with Federico Cantini. I know him since the time university in Siena. We are the same age as the metric, more or less. But most significantly, we have the pleasure of having Edward Harris with us today. So, thank you. My talk today will be divided into 3 sections, as suggested by the title of my reflection on archaeological interfaces. The brief abstract which I prepared together with my colleagues a few weeks ago for this event has piqued the interest of Harris, who was so kind as to write to me to share some of his thoughts on the concept and interface and its semantic value. This has led to a precious dialogue about the idea of interface as a trace of past lives and about the awareness that interfaces are a construct of our own making. Today, my reflection will be focused on the interface as understood at the surface of a stratigraphic unit. When we study to become archaeologists, we learn to distinguish one deposit from another using the concepts of diversity and discontinuity. And we name as interface the inter between the 2 soil layers. So, this interface is a conceptual surface. And as a conceptual surface, it is an empty surface with no traces that we can record. This very empty land, to use Harris' words, has been the stage for the lives of the past, lives nearly invisible through the stratigraphic lens. These lands allow us to see the sequence of soil layers, but these layers often represent the erasures of human life. In this perspective, we see very well something being born, so construction processes, something dying, erasure, but we rarely see something living. And even more rarely, we do see the relationship between things that coexist, namely the functional relationships established on a surface of life within a time. It is precisely in this empty land that archaeologists are called to give their best, to develop a narrative. The interface so becomes the generative element of the archaeological storytelling, the space in which to reconstruct life, relationships, meanings, and it allows to help the people of the past pick out from the archaeological stratification. Coming to teaching archaeological interfaces, I think that these reflections are challenging to convey in an university classroom or in a field research context. It is never easy to explain that invisible traces are as important, if not more so, than the visible ones. The pavement of the Pythion in Gortyn, in Crete, remains an empty surface of traces, but it is full of history, representing century and century of life, from the Roman age to the 7th century AD or even later. Its lack of growth reveals that many micro-stories and the history unfolded on that surface, which we can only reconstruct conceptually. This requires a certain level of abstraction, and today, more than ever, students struggle with abstraction. To be honest, I also was disoriented in Daniele Manacorda classes. How I would have reacted to that first time when my first interface would have appeared under my trowel? Would I have known how to recognize it? If it was a challenge for me and Federico for our generation, it is even more challenging for today's students. In this world of invisible things, the matrix can be a safe haven, as long as you have the ability to transfer the complexity of stratification into the simplicity of its graphic and conceptual representation. A representation which, however, must not flatten and crush the lives between the layers of soil. The matrix is a system so well designed that it can also be transformed into a game of abstraction and aesthetic creativity. I have had the opportunity to play the matrix with very young children, and I was really surprised by how clearly and naturally they understood the rules of the game, but moreover, its usefulness for our work of historical reconstruction, probably because they are more used to imagination. Perhaps it is the education system that has deconceptualized learning, as Lucio Russo points out in his book. The title of this old but gold book alludes to the trend of teaching in particular geometry through a practical, more intuitive and visual method as opposed to the demonstrative method considered too complex, with the risk of a progressive inability to develop abstract reasoning and elaborate general models. Coming finally to being archaeological interfaces, I think that the idea of the interface seems to me also the essence of one of the fundamental missions of the archaeological works, to be the point of contact between the people of the present and the people of the past, women, men, and children, two entities much like two layers of soil made of the same material but with very distinguishable characteristics. And this role represents, I think, one of the most intriguing challenges of our time, to translate archaeological traces into contents that people not only can understand, but moreover perceive as useful for their interests or their well-being. For this reason, 9 years ago, when Federico Cantini developed one of the community archaeology projects related to our research in Vignale, we chose the title Interfacce, Interfaces. We wanted to be the point of contact between the community living near the archaeological site and its past, to be the mediators and facilitators who help to observe everyday life spaces through new interpretative keys. We wanted to be the narrators of stories upon which collective memory and identity could be constructed. We aimed to be the activators of metabolism that provides cultural nourishment. If many years ago Daniele Manacorda or anyone else has asked me to define an archaeological interfaces as the surface of a layer, I might have given a textbook definition. But today, after encountering many interfaces, I would define it as the place of storytelling in which archaeologists generate micro-stories. It's a very complicated space of great responsibility, but also great fun. Thank you.
And I really want to thank, of course, CAMNES, as all the colleagues did in this session, and Dr. Edward Harris for the many things that, I mean, the colleagues already presented, but also for, I think, an issue regarding symbolism, because Harris matrix has become a sort of symbolic element in the, let's say, common identity of archaeologists as a whole, like the trowel, in a way. It's the two things that keep our community also visually together. And also because, like in Italy and for medieval archaeologists, it provided already from the 70s, as also Daniele Manacorda said in his talk, a tool, like kind of a corporate tool or scientific community tool that we used for pointing out our, let's say, view on historical archaeology as regards archaeological communities like the classical archaeology that was very important and large and used different methods at the time. And also, and this relates to what I'm about to say, the use of metrics in the reconstruction of architectural stratigraphies that put the archaeologists in, let's say, first in a very fiercely debated debate with architectural historians, but also then gave us a lot of, like a recognizable place among the figures who can speak about architecture, and also that helped transforming the living world, like also this beautiful place where we are today, in something that can be understood as of an archaeological site, because the formation processes that we see in the excavation we can also, of course, see in around us. And so Daniele Manacorda already introduced the fact that in Italy, archaeology of architecture, that of course was practiced also in England, but in Italy it really became a very big cultural movement, also especially due to the fact that in Italy we have a lot of preserved historic environments, and so this practice links to urban transformation, urban planning, and the possibility of using all this architectural material, especially from the Middle Ages, as a way for enhancing our knowledge of the past. And yeah, this is more or less the result of the fact that this approach really interested our community in Italy. So from the, originally already from the 70s with Tiziano Mannoni, he really very early developed an interest for coupling his studies on medieval and historic architectures with the matrix, but especially since the end of 1980s, we have, with the works of Gianpietro Bergiolo and Roberto Parenti, that I think you met, we have really handbooks, and this practice, and I was an early practitioner in the 90s for my thesis, gave birth to the first journal using stratigraphy for understanding architecture in 1996, and this in turn gave birth to an international journal based in Spain in 2002, Arqueología de la Arquitectura, and also to manuals and handbooks that were written and adopted by architects. In the first period were very much against this approach. Like in 1997, Francesco Doglioni's handbook on stratigraphy and restoration. So this is really a great contribution that I'm sure you're aware of, but maybe not of the size and the extent of how it developed in Italy. At Florence University, but also in Tuscany, also, I mean, the school of Riccardo Frankovic, we used stratigraphy applied to architecture in order to develop tools of light archaeology. So an archaeology that is non-destructive, historical, territorial, and stratigraphic, taking the opportunity of having this very well-preserved architectural, historical environment. And we did a lot of work. This actually allowed the mapping and the dating, for instance, of small architectures and everyday architectures that in the art historical and historical architectural discourse were not really very much addressed because they were lacking stylistic features that normally are used by those colleagues in order to date and to provide an overview of developments of the cities. Related to light archaeology approach, also there's the concept of stratigraphic observatories. So particular architectural complexes that maintain in their material history and stratification not just like their biography, but something that relates to the development of a city, of a territory, and we pretty much address this issue. Now, what are we doing with this? I mean, we are asking, can we represent urban material transformation as a dynamic phenomenon and not just in a, let's say, chronological linear time model? And this, I think, also relates to the talk of Dr. Neubauer, because I've read some of his papers before and also before this meeting. So how we can use not just linear but non-linear time models. We tried to use Husserl's echoes of the events, but actually it didn't work too well because it's not very robust in terms of mathematics. And then we ended up in Allen 13 interval time relations. And so we applied these to Harris metrics and actually to archaeology of architecture. We published a paper on this in 2017 with our colleagues from France, CNRS, who developed the mathematical part of this article, also connecting to 3D GIS. But today I want to speak about stratification of contemporary urban environments, and so how we can conceive of like the modern city in terms of an archaeological site. And this is the Millennium Square diagram that we developed in the framework of a Horizon JPI project last year, in which we are using interval theory together with occupation of space for mapping and for presenting the dynamic transformation of a city. We applied this methodology in Oslo, London, Edinburgh, and Barcelona, and in Florence, where it was first developed in connection to stratigraphy. And I think, okay, my time is running away, so just this. This is like the visualization in the Millennium Square diagram of the Fiat plant in Novoli. This was the case study for Florence. The fact that today we only see in the urban scape the tower, the electric tower, and how the diagram gives reference of the different phases and how the Fiat was first created, then expanded again, then destroyed by a huge negative stratigraphic unit or activity. And so how we can understand like contemporary landscape and urban landscape as the result of a site formation process as you described in 1973. Finally, the Millennium Square diagram also allows us to quantify knowledge, material knowledge like 19%, knowledge of this area from written sources, 5.7%, and ignorance, so 74.8%. And okay, so this is the work we have been developing starting from your idea, so thank you very, very much for being here today.
Inviting me to Florence, and it's more than 20 years ago that I first met Edward Harris in Vienna, and we became friends, and we are discussing the Harris matrix more or less since then. And before I met him, I thought everything is clear with the matrix because it's so brilliant. But then I met him and he came up with all these things that he was thinking, I was never doing this to the final point. I've never thought this really out. There's so many things missing. And that's the point where we started to cooperate. And one of the most important things behind it was to put it to a software. So to get the stratigraphic notation, the Harris matrix, into a logical system that can be programmed, because every individual part of it can be put into mathematic formulas. So that puts me to the point, my own career, I studied archaeology, prehistoric archaeology, but also computer science and mathematics. So this started to combine this, and since more than 30 years I'm within archaeological prospection, combining all different types of non-invasive methodology for archaeology, but also in this respect we're going to follow up a stratigraphic approach. So what I'm going to do now is to give you an update on all the things that have been missing, and several things have been mentioned now before that are important for the further development of the stratigraphic notation Harris matrix. Let me start with the point that Daniele Manacorda put up. If you have a proper science, you also need a proper language. This means that if we want to do this, we should actually, this or that? The yellow one. The yellow one. If we do so, we should actually start and have a clear language. But the most important point behind all is the mentioning of Edward that all archaeological sites are stratified. All. And there is a lot of people still today insisting that this is not true, that they have been excavating a site without stratification and this and that, and they cannot make a stratigraphy from it. Anyway, we're going to have to use this image here, which is from our colleague, which is not to be here, Andrea Carandini, and we actually have to start with the definition of a site. What is a site? A site is a geographic area that shows a stratification created by man or resulting from human activities, so influenced by anthropogenic processes. On the other side, an archaeological site is again a geographically defined area with a man-made stratification of archaeological interest. And as Carandini said, the stratification of a site is like an island in the sea of natural stratification. So it's not just hanging somewhere in the universe, it's embedded. And we will go on with this and look at the archaeological finds. What is an archaeological finds? So we use it in the broadest sense of the word, so everything that can help us in the end to get our stratigraphic sequence ordered through time is important and is therefore an archaeological find. The stratification, again, the stratification is a sequence of archaeological units of stratification, and it's formed by human activities and important natural agents. What is field archaeology? Field archaeology is the thing that cares about these archaeological stratifications, and it's multidisciplinary scientific field research on material remains of past human activities, and this might be true, but it is not. And that's the reason why we heard a lot about interfaces, and there the problem starts. You see a pit. You see a lot of colors, you see a lot of different layers, deposits, whatsoever, but the only thing that you do not see, but is there, is the pit. The pit is immaterial, it's just a hole. And the ditch is not more than a lot of pits in a row. Also, the ditch is immaterial. You can't see it. And as my colleague has said before, there are more immaterial archaeological stratification units in a site than there are material ones. And that's a very important point where we go on. So, field archaeology is multidisciplinary scientific field research on material and immaterial remains of the past human activities. Putting in the immaterial thing is an important thing, and also the view on the whole thing. We don't look on a landscape as a two-dimensional or three-dimensional surface. We look at it as a stratified 3D volume. And this makes a big difference, because whenever we look on a site, on a complete landscape, we actually think about it as a volume. And this volume incorporates all the clues that we can actually sort out the development of its shape and everything through time. On the other side, we have seen this before by our colleague over here, that there is excavation, there is prospection, there is non-invasive and invasive research done in archaeology, and all is open to stratigraphy. So ground-penetrating radar, of course you can come up with some ground-penetrating radar images, but you also can come up with a 3D interpretation model which is sorted through time, which also gives you all the individual units of stratification that you can put in a matrix. Or excavation. The arbitrary excavation still is in use all over the globe on a high extent, even though we know that it is just useless and wrong. The stratigraphic approach is the one we should do. And now, back to the units of stratification, because every unit of stratification is the basic element of a Harris matrix or a stratigraphic sequence. It's the entities, it's like the different amino acids within a DNA, and therefore we have to call them clearly and define them clearly. A deposit is the first one. This is the material part of a stratification. It's defined by the volume and that's important again, the immaterial surface enclosing it. And on the other one, there is surfaces. It's something that has been called many times before interfaces and still is called interfaces. So we're going to use this term now, equal to interfaces. Surfaces are defined by their spatial extent, and they are immaterial. And all these different types of units of stratification, and there is not more than these two, are actually combined to each other with relations. So each unit has to be named uniquely within the process. That's essential. It could be a sequential number, whatever you actually think, but it has to be unique. It needs a unique identifier. To represent deposits, we use a rectangle from now on, and to use the surfaces, we use a circle. You have perfectly shown us circles before. Thank you very much for that. So this is a major change. So within the stratigraphic notation, we have now two types of deposits, and we can sort them through time and build up all these nice 3D models from the sites or whatever. We're going to see this a little bit later on. I have seen this before outside. There's another important thing. When Edward put it to the point that the relational section has to be get rid of, we need the planning of all layers. And also this has started very early in Austria. We started in the mid-1990s to do full 3D documentation with total stations, getting point clouds of things, and this has actually ended up in what you see here, the 3D volumes, representations within one pit. This was in 2008. And this is, of course, combined with the GIS system in the background, where we have all the databases connected to this unit, to this 3D volume, and related by the unique identifier. This three-dimensional planning is something that is, of course, very straightforward, and we're going to do this now for more than a century. Oh, sorry, a decennium. So we have been developing this further and further, also published some of it, but this is a completely other story. But it's important because we have to refine this sentence from Edward, that the current reliance on the section in stratigraphic research should not be replaced on a four-dimensional recording, which should include first and foremost the three-dimensional planning of all its units of stratification. And there we have again these units of stratification, and now it comes to an important point. Every single deposit which is a material is enclosed by surfaces, and you can see that there are two separate surfaces. There's a top surface, there is a deposit itself, the material part, and there is a bottom surface that can be measured, let's say by a laser scanner, or made a 3D model from with image-based modeling or whatsoever. And the new rule is that we're going to put these surfaces together with the immaterial part, and this is why this is actually explained. And if we have a surface from a distinct feature like a pit, it's the same thing. We have this immaterial, it's transparent, it's empty, but we have, and this is important, a top surface and we have a bottom surface. Of course, this is all the same, but it's only the same in space. It's not the same when it comes to time. When it comes to these new definitions, you see that there is this top surface and bottom surfaces of these different elements. So the Harris matrix still looks the same as initially invented by Edward Harris. So then the program started that we actually find out how can we start the first screen on our software. So there is a top surface on the archaeological site. Remember, this is the picture from Carandini. And this is actually the interface to atmosphere. And in between is the unexcavated archaeological stratification, and underneath is the interface to the geological stratification. And this is the same as you have seen with every individual unit. So the site itself has the same system, has the same complexity, the same concept than an individual unit, and every single phase or every single period within the site has the same concept. It's about having a top and a bottom surface that has been representing the site. And the first program that we used had a big problem because we could not actually get all the temporal relations in. One is later than two, that's obvious, but we had no idea what the temporal relation between 2 and 3 is, so we only had to fill it up from the point. And now we talk about using these things, how it goes through time. So there's a creation of a pit, there's time of use of a pit, there's the end of this pit by refilling and creation of a new deposit within. This goes on with the duration, and this is the important point. There is about duration, and duration is something that is actually open to the Allen relations that we have seen before. So due to this, we can build up all these individual units within the software. And the most important thing is that the top surface and the bottom surface are the surfaces which are incorporating the time. So the bottom surface is the start of deposition and the top surface is the end. And in between there is time. And this time is an interval. And the same is for a pit or a ditch. The bottom surface of a ditch is the date of creating this ditch or this pit. And the top surface is when the next or the last minute of this open space has reached. Thank you very much for your attention.
space to discussion to the colleagues and students in the book. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's on? Yeah. Okay. It is indeed a great pleasure to be here. And in the beginning, I would like to thank Stefano and Guido for arranging this meeting, and for my distinguished colleagues. I haven't seen Manacorda for 2 decades. Great pleasure to see you again. And thank you for coming and making presentations today. And to my good friend from Vienna, Dr. Wolfgang Neubauer, who woke me from perhaps a retirement slumber by appearing in Bermuda to demand questions about this system, which he was beginning to teach in Vienna. Ladies and gentlemen, my short talk is going to be looking back a bit. Won't be very academic, but I'm just going to try and give you a sense of how I see looking back on where we are today after 50 years. And so I've called this talk the Search for the Stratigraphic Sequence. So what I've done is to sort of turn things on their head and suggest that I and previous archaeologists were searching for the stratigraphic sequence in the same way that Watson and Crick and Rosalie Franklin were searching for the shape of DNA. And so I think it makes logical sense, but it'll be up to you, the younger generation, to look further into these matters and to see what was happening, not only in Britain, where I take my experience from, but in other countries as well. Where's the... Is this one?
The yellow band.
Oh, the yellow band. Well, we've been talking about interfaces and surfaces and so on. Of course, they come in many forms. And this particular surface is actually the oldest publication of principles of archaeological stratigraphy still in print. So I thank you all in Italy for being the first to jump on the bandwagon in 1983 and for still having the book available in a printed format. Many of the other editions have gone out of print, and we've been fortunate, as they've gone out of print, to be able to get permission to put them on the Harris Matrix website for free downloading. We still don't have the Italian one. You can still buy it, which is wonderful. But thank you again as a country and archaeologists of that country for being the first people to come on board in print to say that this was perhaps a good thing. And in it, of course, is the 50-page introduction by Professor Manacorda, which we've now translated into English. My colleague Genzia, I believe, is in the back, whom I met in California some years ago, but is back in Italy. And we'll soon have that on the website for free downloading as well, because it's an important statement by Professor Manacorda of the development of Italian archaeology and concepts of stratigraphy. Well, it all began for us indirectly in geology, and with this particular chap, James Hutton, who, and we talked about, our colleague here talked about ways of seeing. Hutton went out to find the evidence that he could see to explain geological principles. And the drawing that you see there in black and white is in fact the profile in which he found what was later called an unconformity, which is still a strong word in geology, equated, if you will, to interface. And we'll see that more better outlined before, because of this, of course, is like an archaeological profile, and they really haven't defined the surfaces. A recent book came out by, as it happened, a friend of mine, and I recently obtained a copy of it, which caused me to again to look back at where we were going. But it all started in geology, and this is in the 1790s. The word unconformity was not invented by Hutton, it came later on. But what he basically said was there are surfaces that represent immeasurable periods of time showing the erosion of deposits such as the ones upright, that this was part of the explanation of the stratigraphic development of the world. So again, I'm speaking very generally today, so you can take all of this with a grain of salt, but it's up to you younger people to do your own research and develop things further. And if you prove me wrong or whatever, it doesn't matter. It's all part of science. It's good that you do. But anyway, archaeology, certainly in Britain, takes its sort of iconic beginnings from the excavations done by a chap called General Pitt Rivers. This chap was wealthy enough to have his own mini empire in Britain with archaeological sites on his property, which he dug up, tumuli and so forth, and made very precise drawings of the stratification. Now, this was hailed as the beginning of stratigraphic development in British archaeology, particularly by Sir Mortimer Wheeler, who perhaps imagined himself as a general as well, although he didn't quite get that far. Next to it, I show you a book called Archaeology's Visual Culture, which comes from a geographer rather than an archaeologist, but it's a wonderful compendium of ways of seeing in archaeology, including a major chapter on stratigraphy, and I hope all of you might get a chance to see that at some point. He starts the book off by saying, in front of me I have these huge volumes published by General Pitt Rivers, and next to it is this very small book on archaeological stratigraphy. How do these two relate? A wonderful discussion of ways of seeing in archaeology. Anyway, we hail back to General Pitt Rivers in the 1890s. And so again, I'm talking about an unconscious search for the stratigraphic sequence. And so I would identify a couple of points. Again, these are unconscious. They weren't said so at the time. Nobody claimed it. They were making other claims. But in the excavations at Maiden Castle in Britain in the 30s, several things happened. One was he established this way of digging, the grid system, as it's called, on the right. And the other, he did two important things, or it may have been he and his wife. We have to investigate who. Tessa Wheeler is also an archaeologist. But he identified the surfaces or interfaces by hard lines in the profile drawings, and he also gave unique numbers to each deposit so that the artifacts could be associated with that unique number, and therefore began the way you could track them in analysis and so on. And these may be, not the digging side of it, but the recording side of it may be the first steps towards finding a stratigraphic sequence, because of course sections are only indicative of the calendar for archaeological sites, the stratigraphic sequence or the matrix, just as the sun coming up in the morning is only indicative of the Gregorian calendar. The other thing that took hold, very much took hold, was this way of excavating sites, dividing it up into grids, as our colleague Thierry from Norway mentioned the other day. It's an aspect of control. You're making it look very scientific. You're controlling the dig by putting this grid on and so on, and there may be something in that. But anyway, it did take hold for a number of decades in British archaeology. The problem with it was that Wheeler argued against excavating on the drawing that you see, the excavator's trench, removing the stratigraphy from walls, in other words, trenching along the walls and so on. But in his actual method of digging, he created a similar sort of situation, because since surfaces weren't recorded, you were separating the stratification inside of an excavation with the sections on the outside, so you could never really connect them. And also having those great bulks in the middle so you could push a wheelbarrow down it, those bulks, as I did myself, were summarily destroyed, so the stratification in the bulk was destroyed without connecting the separate areas and so on. So there were some missteps, if you will, in the development. The next thing that really happened, which I think is a major indicator in the search for the stratigraphic sequence, was done by Kathleen Kenyon with her diagram for phasing. And of course, she's using the section as the medium for that. But basically, this represents a jumping over what you should have had first, which is a stratigraphic sequence, which you then divide up and phase into periods and so forth and so on. But she was making an attempt, and in my moving towards trying to find a solution for how you deal with this information that you've excavated. And here she's only given a very simple example, and the trouble is that when you get large amounts of stratification, this system doesn't work, it cannot work. So, in 1967, I dropped out of university and went to dig in England because they said you didn't have to pay them, unlike going to a field school in the United States, and they'd give you a roof over your head and 2 and 6 a day for lunch. And it was marvelous archaeology, as you can see here. This is the Great Hall of the Bishop's Palace, which I had the privilege of being the supervisor for the excavation. So we went from the medieval period right down through into Roman levels. And another aspect of striving towards how to deal with stratification, they got into very detailed planning of surfaces, such as you see in the hippie there on the picture. These stopped the excavations for weeks in some instances because they took so long. And the problem was you were often recording a period surface that included the period of excavation, because the excavation in every place didn't always go down uniformly. And the other problem with those things is you can't break them apart. And if you do, you've got data holes underneath. If you take one surface off, you've got a data hole underneath of it. They were also conflating the deposits and the surfaces because they'd record the color of the deposit, rocks that might be protruding out of the thing into the surface, and so on. So they were trying to move matters ahead. And the other thing that took place was that they were beginning to identify the unconformities in archaeological stratigraphy, that is to say, the pits that were just surfaces and were not deposits. So in the records for those digs, this is one of them that took place in where I first started digging in 1967. You see all those little dots on the landscape. Those are the layer numbers that were pasted onto layers of features and so on. So the features they were beginning to identify as surfaces without deposits, and that they were unusual. And I think what I meant by that was they destroyed pre-existing stratification, and therefore they are upsetting a normal deck of card evolution. So anyway, we had 6 wonderful summers of digging there. And then I went to Norway for a year, where they recorded in an entirely different way, which started one thinking about matters. So I returned to Winchester early in 1973 and was given a site to sort out. And what we know by that means make a stratigraphic sequence. You can't do the phasing, anything else, unless you have the basic stratigraphic sequence for the site. And it was basically like the Kenyon system. It was a verbal thing. You started writing what you thought were phases because this was on top of that and that was underneath that, so it was on. And it was all written. And the problem is your brain simply can't cope with it. You turn the page and you can't remember what happened 2 pages before. So we made these sort of doodles to try and arrange things. And it was really as a result of that I felt that if I couldn't have a way of seeing, I'd go bananas. And so I started to straighten up these diagrams as on the left. And on the evening of 28th of February, I was working with a clear piece of mylar with a gridded piece underneath of it, and I started doodling and making half centimeters rectangles. And after I'd made about that many, I knew the world had changed. And so the one on this side here is one of the first ones using the rectangles, in other words, to really organize it and so on. And from that, I went on that evening to make the first matrix diagram, which you see there in black and white. And I called it the matrix diagram in jest on the bottom there, and on the left I actually called it a layer chart. Why was that? Because, of course, as diggers, we were obsessed with digging, and surfaces are immaterial, you can't dig them, so they're largely ignored, until we began to realize that surfaces are central to the establishment of stratigraphic sequences. Anyway, once I had this diagram, it only took 3 months by hand to do the 10,000 units you see there on the color picture on the right, stratigraphic sequence for the Lower Brook Street site. And you can immediately see that these sequences give some sort of form to the stratification, the development of the site. You have the Roman period, then a collapse almost in the Anglo-Saxon period, and then an explosion of houses built on the site in the medieval period. And from there, I was doing an excavation at the time with Martin Biddle, and I immediately upon finishing the excavation, I turned the records we had made into a stratigraphic sequence. So that was the first pure stratigraphic sequence for a recent archaeological site. I then went on to show that the stratigraphic sequence can be subdivided on stratigraphic principles into phases. Those can be grouped into periods on stratigraphic principles, and once you reach that stage, now of course you have all these wonderful things like GIS. You can flip it around and recreate your topography of your site based upon everything that you fed into the stratigraphic sequence in terms of artifact analysis and so on. So that was the sort of the basics of it, and so the question is, where did this come from? I'm not a scholar like my distinguished friends here. This didn't come from years of work. The matrix was an accident, and in my view, it was a visual accident. It was a way of seeing rather than studied academic research leading towards a particular conclusion. And looking back on it, I well remember there were several things at the time, or in the case of the double helix book, it was for the time. Now, the double helix book became very, very famous. It was a book about the discovery of the shape of DNA. And I read that book, and I said to myself, being a lazy archaeologist, this is the way to go. These chaps were enjoying themselves in London and Copenhagen, having a good time and so on. Meanwhile, Rosalind Franklin was working very hard in the lab, and she missed out being the discoverer of the shape of DNA by several months. And she got nothing for it. They got Nobel Prize. Anyway, that wasn't the really important thing. The really important thing is they were playing with models. They were playing with Linus Pauling's atomic models, as you see there in the middle. And the picture in the middle is actually an artifact. It's part of his collection at a university. It's an early one of his molecular models, which they preserved as part of the evidence of how he came to use these models and how Watson and Crick played with them to get the shape of DNA. And another thing that came out just before the Matrix was a book called Ways of Seeing by John Berger, acclaimed art critic. And what he did was say, look, we can look at a painting, or if you will, we'll look at an archaeological profile, but there are different ways of seeing. And he introduced into the whole thing a different way of looking at paintings and drawing out more information from them. And I do look back on it, see that the coming of the matrix was a different way of seeing stratification and realizing that we had to create these models for what basically was invisible, the time elements on an archaeological site. And again, a lot of this is sort of, you know, how to place it and so on, but I, many times before the invention of the matrix, went on the Underground, and I love this diagram. And what it has in common, and I think helped perhaps in the background to create the matrix, is it was the first diagram to ignore the geography and to show only the time sequence. In the same way that we can ignore the sections and everything else, we need our time diagram. So in order to get from Oxford Circus to wherever, you have to go this way. In order to get from the bottom of our archaeological sites to the top, you have to follow the stratigraphic train lines, if you will. And I actually possess an original of this. I was working in London just before the publication of Principles, and I was working on the conversion of Georgian houses to apartment, and in the basement there was an old picture up against the wall, and I almost put the pickaxe through it, and I said, let me have a look at it first, and it was one of H.C. Beck's original underground diagrams, which I still have. And so there is Linus Pauling in California with one of his molecular models, and on the right is diagram I made to suggest Linus Pauling took molecular biology from 1 dimension to 3. We took archaeology from 1 dimension of the section to 4 dimensions because we have 3 dimensions in time and 3 dimensions in space and 1 for time, which is what our business is all about. So we changed the paradigm from the section to an abstract diagram because, of course, it's time. It's the DNA model, if you will, for every archaeological site, which is unique. And the only way to represent it is abstractly. And this is the 3rd most important calendar for archaeologists. If you have an old-fashioned watch, that's a major diagram of time, helps you to organize. We all got here on time today because of that. You have the Gregorian calendar, and if you're an archaeologist, you have the matrix diagram. Your diagram. And every archaeological site has a unique stratigraphic sequence, and that is its value, overriding value to history. And part of this is, come back to again, and to my colleague talking about interfaces, and in fact what most people are talking about today is the stuff that we live in, like we're living in here today in this multi-surfaces building. But we realized that we had to record every surface, and if you did that, you could, if you had the notation, you could recreate a stratigraphic sequence anytime after the site just by overlaying the deposits and making your notations on the side. So this was introduced to me by a fellow called Lawrence Keane, who I'm now trying to find again to find out what his background was on this idea, because he was doing it on some archaeological digs. But this is the essence of it, and this is the as our colleague says, this is after the excavation is over, the reconstruction of archaeological sites, or the reconstruction of the experiment that we've done as an excavation, relies on the surfaces. You're reconstructing the topography. The volumes of the things, in a sense, don't matter when you're reconstructing the site. So this was the missing element. Is why it took 5 years, once the matrix was there, to figure out what we weren't doing properly to make it work. So I come back to end it all. And you'll see the wine bottle there that I'm holding. For the 35th anniversary, Professor Neubauer kindly gave me a party up in the wilds on the edge of the Roman border in the middle of winter. And I had to carry that wine bottle home, signed by everybody. And I thank you for that. It was a splendid party. All the food was made of Roman buildings or tumuli in jelly with bodies in it and so forth. We ate it all. I want to come back to where I began, which is Hutton's unconformity at the bottom there. This is where it all started in geology, is the major thing. And of course, they don't call these surfaces, generally speaking, they're disconformities, unconformities, blah, 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 fake news, whatever. But it was the beginning of understanding the nature of stratification, and that some of these surfaces were more than just deck of cards surfaces, but they represented great breaks in the geological record. Well, I leave you with the thought today that we have created the greatest unconformity of them all. On the surface of the earth, we have created millions, if not trillions of tons of new types of stratification. If we all disappeared tomorrow and the aliens came in, they would obviously identify this, and it's at different times in different places, but this is the greatest change, if you will, in geological stratigraphy that has taken place once people began to build buildings. And our job as archaeologists, and particularly you of the younger generations who are kind enough to come out today, Our job is to open up that unconformity, to get into the interfaces, to recreate how people lived in the past with the help of the material that is buried in the deposits. And we have a great responsibility because of this, and we also have a unique and wonderful job, as I'm sure the professors well know, and you younger people will be being introduced to recreate what happened in the past for all of humanity. Ours is a unique profession. As a friend of mine, now deceased but buried in his digging clothes with his trowels and his hat and so on, felt that if society was a bulldozer, archaeology was the leading edge of the great shovel. And we've made tremendous contributions to understanding what we are as people. So we are the greatest unconformity, and it's our responsibility to capture that data on every single archaeological site for posterity and to keep us happy as diggers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Edward. I think now is the moment to give space to a little bit of discussion, suggestion, comments. So if there is anybody who want to take the microphone, please.
Okay, and just out of curiosity, but how does it feel to carry all the weight of this revolution, like, on you? How do you feel about it?
I feel very fortunate. The Harris matrix doesn't mean anything. It's not a mathematical formula or something. I put it on there by accident. And I feel very fortunate that for some reason, what is the stratigraphic sequence of a site is called a Harris matrix. Been very kind of the profession to do so. But after 50 years, I feel fortunate because of that. Like, there's no money in archaeology, so, we've become a millionaire doing this. But no, it's been a pleasant experience. And when I come to somewhere like Florence and with all your kindness expressed to me for something I did so long ago, I'm not really sure how it happened, when it happened, or whatever. It's very, very kind of you indeed. Fortunately, you didn't write as colleagues did from Barcelona some years ago. We've been sitting around here discussing how the book came into Barcelona, which train and who was carrying it and so forth. And Professor, are you dead? And that was their letter to me. So I can't really say. It's been a wonderful journey. It still is, because there's a lot more to do. It always will be, but there's a lot more to do in the development of principles of archaeological stratigraphy. Some geologists were furious about this, that we would move away from their principle. I tried once to publish a paper on the interface in America, and I got review back, and it basically was like I was writing in the Wild West, and they said, this chap should be run out of the profession, get rid of him, and so on. A lot of people got very annoyed about this stuff, but I've been lucky, if you will, that it seems to have gone on, seems to provide help and value to everybody, which is, that's the reward, really. And we decided, because the publishers wouldn't do the original paperback, so we bought them out, and Dr. Neubauer and colleagues at the University of Vienna made the first website so that people could download it for free, because if we want to take over the world, that's the way to do it. And now there are about 10 editions for free downloading on the web. So I've been very fortunate to live in the profession of archaeology. It's been a wonderful time. At the end of it all, I'm just very grateful for occasionally being at a wonderful venue like this and finding people so gracious and courteous, and they seem to think I did something. But it's very kind. I thank you all. More questions?
More comments?
Se volete fare domande in italiano, ci occupiamo noi della traduzione eventuale.
Thank you. So thank you for the presentations and to be here. And so maybe I misunderstood, I don't know, but from the presentation of Professor Neubauer, maybe you said that there's something to add to this methodology, there's something to refine still?
Yes. The main point is that we have actually a spatio-temporal problem behind us. And the first thing is that it is about 3 dimensions, so whatever we look on is that we have a volume behind us. And also getting these volumes into place needs to discuss about how these volumes can be measured, how they can be recorded. And we have heard this before from the early excavations when she was looking to find an interface. So you don't see the surface, but you can, and this is the difference, you can record the surface with a laser scanner, you can make a 3-dimensional model of a laser scanner with your iPhone, but you can't measure, you can't actually make a 3D model of a deposit, because the immaterial thing can be measured, but the material not. And that's the big difference. And the next thing is the incorporation of time and how this is related to the material and the immaterial aspects. As she said earlier, you can walk on this surface for many years, walk in and out the temple. There's a lot of activities going on. There's all the stories told more or less based on the surface. So a surface, and that's the reason why we have bottom on the top surface within the new system of recording. The bottom is the beginning when this surface became in use. Let's say the floor of this former temple, which is now has transformed into something completely different. The floor is still there. So there is no change on this specific surface, even though within the centuries a lot has changed. And this is the important thing, that we not only have to look on the specific material aspects, but especially on the surfaces, because the surfaces are incorporating more time than every single deposit. And the next thing is that these surfaces are separating the finds within the material parts. So every deposit has finds that are contemporary, that might be much older or might be younger. And the probability for this is always the same. So an analysis of an archaeological stratification, when it comes to time, is only possible when you use the complete backbone, which is the stratigraphic sequence, and when you are able to relate all these different things that are in relation to each other. And I did not have the time to come closer to the interval-based time models on the Allen relations. This is something that has been published in 1986 based on the analysis of texts. And this is something that has been not really got into archaeology at all, even though archaeology is about time. And it's about the point that if 2 deposits are developing aside of each other, they might start earlier, this might start within the same time, and then. And there are certain relations how things can be related in intervals, and this is the difference from what we have seen before. When Edward actually did write his book, he was still talking about points in time. And there is only contemporary, later, and earlier. But when you look on interval, I have been born long before you were born, and I might dying earlier than you do, but you also could be the difference that you might die earlier than I, and I'm going to live on. And that's the point. It's about how the things that we excavate are related to time, and the clue to it is surfaces. Only the surfaces, and this is something that has been named interface, as she correctly said, because at that time all these people did see the interface as something between two material things. But they are surfaces in their own right. And you don't need the material of the floor, and you don't need the material of this roof to define a floor where you can walk on. And that's the big difference, how we see today an archaeological stratigraphic sequence. Thank you.
Edward, a difficult question, your opinion on something. A lot of times me and Stefano discuss of what is an archaeologist, its profile, because he has to do so many things. I mean, he has to be an expert in his field, he has to know how to do a matrix, he has to know how to do photography, he has to know how to do public relations, he has to be a communicator, public archaeology, so many things. Do we need all that? Should we compart that? What's your idea of the future in archaeology and the profile of an archaeologist?
Well, I went to university, my BA in America, and there the anthropologists had taken over archaeology because they were the ones who got the money in the first instance for going out and studying primitive people, what have you. And so archaeologists there were forced, in my view, into a bind of becoming anthropologists and somehow so forth, where they're two, in my view, two entirely different things. It's almost as if we are the ones dealing with the site, and you put the anthropologists into the interface where they belong, looking at what have you. Anyway, sorry, lost my train of thought. The point is, it's my view that as archaeologists, we should be first stratigraphers. A lot of the sense you get in archaeological circles is we're supposed to be all things to all people. We're supposed to know how to do this, know how to do that, blah, 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 blah. Meanwhile, our fundamentals are not being taken care of. I think it's the American Archaeological Association has a code of ethics, and they have 70 pages on how to deal with native peoples, and not one page on the archaeologist's responsibility to the stratigraphic nature of sites and how to dig them, what you should do. It's almost as if engineers had no code, so every time they put up a building, it collapsed. So in the first instance, we should be stratigraphers. That is our fundamental job, if we're digging. And even when we're not digging, if you're going specialist, whatever it is, nowadays you should be given a stratigraphic sequence and the material and an indication of where these things occur in the sequence. And then you do your analysis, but you understand enough about stratification so that you can know when the artifacts are wrong or not in sync or whatever, they're not giving you the right sort of dates in the column, not just individually, because the old way was to look at an individual thing and say X, Y, and Z. So, no. We should be taught as archaeologists absolute fundamental business of stratification. And from there, it depends on, in my view, what people like to do. Some people may like to look at the whole of cities. Other people may like to zero in on buildings and so on, which is a different aspect of the discipline. But fundamentally, we should start with the basis. And we shouldn't be, it shouldn't be claimed that we should be anthropologists first. We should be archaeologists. It's a unique profession, a unique discipline, and it's ours. And why I was putting there is the great unconformity is we should be daily staking our claim that we are one of the most important professions to the history of people on Earth. We're the ones that define what no one else can do because it's dead and buried and there are no records or whatever. So, no, be a good stratigrapher first and then you can branch out and do whatever else you like. But I don't believe that we should try to be all things to all people. It's not possible. It's anyway. So, be a wonderful stratigrapher and enjoy it. There's nothing better than stratigraphy. And as one of the professors suggested, if you become a good stratigrapher and you understand stratification, it changes the way you look at the entire world. It does. If you're a motorbike enthusiast and take your engine apart to fix it, you're doing a stratigraphic exercise. So much of what we do in daily life is a stratigraphic exercise, and if we understand it as we should fundamentally, it changes the entire way you look at the world. When I look at an old building, a little analysis of things, I can see the infilling things where they blocked up a window popping out, cartoon-like and so on, because you understand stratigraphy. You walk down the street and you trip over a pothole, interface, whatever. So, yes. Thank you. I should just like to say to the younger people, you have a unique opportunities now in the modern world, because with the advent of the PC computer and all the digital stuff, you have tremendous possibilities, particularly with surfaces, to reconstruct, which before was done by hand, which is why people didn't record all the surfaces that were taken forever and so on. And I think you exist at a wonderful time to get so much more information more rapidly out of your archaeological sites, and to manage this information through using the computer. So I'm sort of jealous of the younger generation. The drawings that you saw today, I did a lot of them by hand with those transfer, what it already used to be called, the transfer print things and so on. And took a lot of time, but you're at a wonderful age because of the digital age, and I hope you all take full advantage of it, and I know you will, and seeing all of the examples today shows the value of computer illustration. I mean, most of what was presented by you all today could not have been done 30 years ago. It might have been done, but it would have taken you forever to do it by hand and so on. So it's a wonderful age to be an archaeologist, to be a student of archaeology, and I commend you all to continue in it and to help wherever you're working to bring people back to life by digging up the deposits and recreating what happened in the interfaces.
I would like to add only comments, because we don't have with us Emanuel Demetrescu, who is a researcher of the National Council for Research, but I had no time to mention also this development, but maybe it is interesting to observe that one of the development of the matrix is the extended matrix by Demetrescu, who is a formalized system very useful for the architecture and for the anastylosis of monuments, be it real or virtual, of course. So there is a lot to do with this idea in mind, and we can develop other ways, not strictly connected with the excavation, but always with the same perspective.
So as Steve Jobs sometimes finished his presentation, there is one more thing coming up. So obviously I would like to thank all the speakers here for being with us, for their talks. I would like to thank the audience, but especially, clearly, I would like to thank Edward Harris for being here and for his work. And for this reason, today we would like to present him a recognition to fix also in our memories this special anniversary. This is a special ceremonial trowel, something that actually takes place in England usually. I'm sure that in most cases there's a Freemasonry significance. There isn't here. This is purely an archaeological symbol. Thank you again, Edward, and congratulations. Yes, let's take a picture all together. Facciamo una foto insieme. Yeah, Elisabetta Giorgi proponeva di fare una foto con tutti gli studenti. Let's do a picture with all the students. Buona idea.
Vediamo qua davanti al tavolo, forse.
Venite, venite. Sì, questa va bene, penso.
La locandina.
Allora, Edward, put yourself here, Edward, I would say come here, and you can, voi andate tutti dietro magari.
Va bene.
Tirate indietro le sedie magari, grazie. Allora, poi magari noi relatori veniamo qua con lui, gli studenti dietro sulle scale.
Io penso che lui deve stare qua, almeno si vede nella foto.
Finisce di indirizzare. Ok, let's go there.
Perché poi si vede la foto.
Giusto. A pyramid.
Ok.
Allora, voi mettetevi davanti qua.
Facciamo un gruppo su tutti. Appoggiati lì.
Come calciatori.
Pino, Jacopo, vieni qua, c'è tu, un professionista. Dai, lo pagano. Ragazzi, dai, venite.
Anche Wolfgang.
Anche non più ragazzi.
Dai, su.
Aspetta, si aggiungono un'altra persona, via.
Sì, sì.
Ma riempiamola sta foto, è un momento epocale.
Grazie.